After 18 months investigating illegal land use practices across 3 states, all I wanted was the comfort of my own home. The overseas assignment had been grueling, constant surveillance, meticulous documentation, and the steady pressure of building airtight cases against corporations circumventing environmental regulations. But that was behind me now. As I navigated the familiar winding roads leading to my grandparents' old property, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to release. The sprawling parcel of land had been my sanctuary since childhood, and inheriting it 5 years ago had been both an honor and a responsibility I took seriously. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meadows as I turned onto the private road leading to my home. Something caught my eye immediately: tire tracks that should not have been there, cutting through the tall grass in a deliberate path toward the eastern meadow. My federal agent instincts, never fully dormant, sparked to life as I parked my car and followed the tracks on foot. The serenity of homecoming shattered as I crested the small hill overlooking my favorite part of the property, the wildflower meadow where my grandmother and I used to identify butterflies. Where there should have been an expanse of untamed nature, I found rows of stone markers, freshly planted flowers, and the unmistakable shape of grave sites. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. Someone had built a cemetery, an actual cemetery, on my land while I was away. I stood motionless, the golden hour light illuminating what could only be described as a violation of the most fundamental kind. This was not vandalism. This was not trespassing. This was something far more calculated, far more permanent. Someone had buried their dead on my property without consent, without permits, without any legal right whatsoever. As the initial shock subsided, my investigative training took over. I began documenting everything with my phone, carefully walking the perimeter of this illegal cemetery, counting at least 15 grave sites, some appearing quite recent. The peaceful homecoming I had envisioned had transformed into something unrecognizable. As darkness fell over my property, I returned to my house with one thought crystallizing in my mind. Whoever did this had no idea who they were dealing with. Morning brought clarity and purpose. After a night of restless sleep, I began methodical research into how this could have possibly happened. My first call was to my neighbor, Stanley, an elderly man who had watched over my property during previous absences. "Oh, thank goodness you are home," he said, his voice conveying genuine relief. "I tried calling your emergency number several times, but it always went to voicemail. That HOA president, Catherine Wellington, she told everyone you had abandoned the property and donated that section for the new cemetery." "I never donated anything," I replied, struggling to keep my voice even. "And I have never been part of any HOA. My property predates the development of this entire area." "We all knew something was not right," Stanley continued. "But Catherine had papers with your signature. She showed them at the town council meeting. And when some of us questioned it, she threatened special assessments on our properties for disrupting community progress." Over the next several hours, I pieced together what had happened through calls with other neighbors and online research. The local cemetery had reached capacity months ago, and rather than go through proper channels to purchase new land, a process that would require budget approvals and environmental impact studies, the HOA president had simply annexed part of my property. She claimed it was abandoned land and produced documents that allegedly showed my consent. I found local news articles featuring Catherine Wellington proudly announcing the community memorial garden as her solution to the cemetery crisis. There she stood in photos, wearing an expensive suit, ceremoniously cutting a ribbon on MY property, taking credit for her generous solution. What infuriated me most was not just the audacity of the theft, but how she had exploited grieving families in the process. As a federal agent specializing in land use regulations, I recognized multiple serious violations. But rather than immediately revealing my professional identity, I decided a more comprehensive investigation would yield better results. I needed to understand the full scope of corruption before taking action. So I did what I was trained to do. I began building a case, meticulously and methodically, without alerting my target. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. Catherine Wellington had transformed the community HOA into her personal fiefdom over the past 7 years. Former board members, speaking confidentially, described a pattern of intimidation and selective enforcement that had forced compliance through fear. Several had resigned after questioning financial discrepancies, only to find themselves suddenly facing thousands in HOA fines for trivial violations. The local coffee shop became my informal intelligence gathering post. Presenting myself as simply a returning property owner, I listened to stories from residents who had no idea they were speaking to a federal agent. One woman tearfully described how Catherine had forced her elderly mother to sell her home of 30 years after issuing daily fines for a mailbox that was apparently 2 inches too short. The house was subsequently purchased by Catherine's sister at well below market value. I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting, slipping in quietly and taking a seat in the back. Catherine Wellington commanded the room with practiced authority, dressed impeccably with a perpetual expression of condescending concern. I studied her as she dismissed valid concerns from homeowners with rehearsed phrases about community standards and property values. When discussion turned to the Memorial Garden expansion, I witnessed audacity in its purest form. Catherine presented elaborate plans to develop more of MY land, complete with walking paths and decorative features, speaking about the project as if the land had always belonged to the association. "But does not that land have an owner?" an elderly man asked from the front row. Catherine's smile never wavered as she responded with complete confidence. "Abandoned property reverts to community use after sufficient notice according to Statute 47B, she stated authoritatively. I nearly laughed out loud. There was no such statute. She was fabricating legal justifications on the spot, counting on no one having the expertise to challenge her. As the meeting concluded, Catherine noticed me, a new face, and approached with practiced charm. "I do not believe we have met. Are you new to the community?" she asked, extending a manicured hand. "Just returned," I replied simply. "I inherited the old Miller property from my grandparents." A brief flash of something, recognition, perhaps concern, crossed her features before her smile reasserted itself. "Wonderful. We will have to get you properly integrated into our HOA system. There are several compliance issues with that property that need immediate attention." "I was not aware my property was part of any HOA," I replied innocently. "It predates the development." "All properties in this district are subject to community governance," she said firmly. "My assistant will send you the necessary paperwork and a list of current violations that need addressing. Welcome home." And with that, she turned to her next target, dismissing me entirely. I left the meeting with even greater resolve. Catherine Wellington was not just manipulative. She was a predator who had found the perfect hunting ground in a community association with minimal oversight. But before taking action against her, I needed to address the most immediate concern: the families who had buried loved ones on my property under false pretenses. The first family I approached was the Hendersons. Their mother had been buried in the new Memorial Garden just 2 months earlier. I knocked on their door on a Sunday afternoon, introducing myself simply as the owner of the property where their mother was now buried. Their horror was immediate and genuine. "But Ms. Wellington assured us everything was properly deeded and permitted," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice trembling. "We paid $15,000 for that plot and perpetual care." "15,000?" I asked, carefully maintaining a neutral expression while internally calculating how much money had changed hands through this scheme. "May I see the paperwork for that transaction?" What they showed me confirmed my suspicions. The payment had gone directly to something called Wellington Community Management LLC, a private company, not the HOA itself. The document featured elaborate language about perpetual easements and community memorial preservation, but lacked any actual legal validity. It was designed to look impressive to grieving families who were unlikely to consult real estate attorneys during their time of loss. "I want to assure you," I said gently, seeing their distress, "I have no intention of disturbing your mother's resting place, but I do need your help to address what I believe is serious fraud that has victimized your family and others." Similar conversations with other families revealed the same pattern. Each had paid substantial sums directly to Catherine's company, not to the HOA. Each had been rushed through the process because paperwork for the new cemetery location might take time, and each felt a growing sense of betrayal as I carefully explained the situation without yet revealing my federal position. One crucial detail emerged from these conversations. Catherine had told several families that cremation was not an option because the temporary memorial garden permits do not allow for cremated remains. This fabricated restriction had forced families into more expensive traditional burials, maximizing her profit while also making the situation more difficult to remedy. It was calculated cruelty disguised as bureaucratic necessity. With each family I spoke to, I gained not just evidence but allies. Many willingly provided copies of their paperwork and signed statements about what they had been told. The case was building, but I needed to be thorough. Catherine Wellington had likely been operating this way for years. I would have just one chance to ensure justice was properly served. Back at my home, I transformed my dining room into an investigation headquarters. Papers covered every surface as I documented each violation: trespassing, fraud, falsification of public records, operating an illegal cemetery without permits, environmental violations for burials without proper assessment, misappropriation of funds, and potential tax fraud. Each charge was meticulously supported with evidence, witness statements, and relevant legal codes, both state and federal. I contacted trusted colleagues at various agencies, carefully building a coordinated response. The Environmental Protection Agency was particularly interested in the unauthorized cemetery development without proper groundwater impact studies. The IRS was equally intrigued by the private company collecting tax-free, community funds, and my own agency had jurisdiction over several aspects of the land use violations. As my investigation progressed, Catherine apparently sensed someone asking questions. The intimidation campaign began with an official-looking notice on my door citing non-compliant landscaping and unauthorized structures, ironically referring to the very cemetery she had established illegally. The notice included potential daily fines of $500 for violations of HOA codes that had never legally applied to my property. When I ignored this notice, more followed. Each escalated in both demands and threats, culminating in a document claiming my property had been rezoned for community use with fabricated municipal codes and a deadline to vacate certain portions of my own land. Rather than responding, I added each notice to my evidence file, documenting this pattern of intimidation that would strengthen the eventual case. 2 weeks into my investigation, a certified letter arrived containing a final notice that included language threatening to place a lien on my property for non-payment of community assessments dating back 7 years. The fabricated debt totaled over $27,000. Most homeowners would have panicked, perhaps even considered paying to avoid losing their home. Instead, I carefully added it to my evidence file with a note documenting the mail fraud aspect of her operation. The investigation was nearly complete when I discovered Catherine had scheduled a special town meeting to address cemetery expansion. The agenda included voting on allocating HOA funds to develop additional portions of my property into an expanded memorial garden with walking paths and decorative features. This meeting would provide the perfect opportunity for the confrontation I had been meticulously planning. The town hall was packed when I arrived, deliberately timing my entrance to slip in just as the meeting began. Catherine stood at the podium in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most residents earned in a week. Behind her, a professional presentation displayed architectural renderings of a beautiful memorial garden on land that belonged to me. "As you can see," Catherine said, gesturing to the screen, "Phase 2 of our community memorial garden will provide our residents with not just additional burial capacity, but a place for reflection and remembrance. The walking paths and meditation areas will transform what was once neglected space into a community treasure." She continued detailing the project, emphasizing how her leadership had solved the cemetery crisis when county officials failed our community. The presentation concluded with a timeline for construction and a budget breakdown that would require a modest special assessment from all residents. After polite applause, she asked if there were any questions. Several hands raised, mostly with technical questions about the design or timeline. Catherine answered each with practiced confidence, clearly believing this was just another rubber stamp approval of her plans. Finally, I raised my hand. Catherine pointed to me with the smile of someone who believes they are in complete control. "Yes, the gentleman in the back," she said pleasantly, not yet recognizing me from our brief meeting. I stood and walked not to the audience microphone, but toward the front of the room. "Thank you, Ms. Wellington. I have several questions about this project." I reached the edge of the stage before continuing. "Primarily, I am curious about how you plan to develop land that legally belongs to me without my permission." Her expression flickered briefly before recovering. "As I explained to you previously, all properties in this district are subject to community governance and—" I interrupted her, something I suspected rarely happened. "Before you continue, I should properly introduce myself." I reached into my jacket and withdrew my federal credentials, holding them up for both her and the audience to see. "I am Supervisory Special Agent with the Federal Land Management Enforcement Division, and you have been developing an illegal cemetery on my private property." The room fell silent. Catherine's professional smile remained frozen in place, but her eyes darted side to side, calculating. "There must be some misunderstanding," she began, her voice slightly higher than before. "The community memorial garden was established through proper channels with all appropriate permissions." "No, Ms. Wellington, it was not," I replied calmly, setting my briefcase on the stage and opening it. "And I believe it is important that everyone here understands exactly what has been happening." I connected my laptop to the projector, replacing her architectural renderings with documentation of her scheme. For the past 7 years, Ms. Wellington has been operating this HOA as her personal fiefdom, using intimidation and fraud to extract money from residents. I methodically outlined each violation, displaying evidence on the screen. The forged signatures on documents claiming I had donated my land, the fabricated municipal codes, the financial records showing payments going to her private company rather than the HOA accounts. Families in mourning were charged thousands of dollars for illegal burial plots on land she did not own and had no right to sell, I continued, advancing to images of the payment records provided by the families I had interviewed. These payments went not to the HOA, but directly to Wellington Community Management, LLC, a private company owned solely by Catherine Wellington. Catherine attempted to interrupt several times, her composure cracking with each piece of evidence presented. "This is absurd. I have served this community faithfully for years. These accusations are federal offenses," I finished for her, "carrying significant penalties." I produced official federal orders freezing all HOA accounts pending investigation. As of this morning, the Department of Justice has opened a formal investigation into these activities. Several other federal agencies are conducting a full audit of all HOA finances and activities under Ms. Wellington's leadership. Catherine's face had lost all color. She grabbed her papers from the podium and made a move toward the side exit, only to find it opening from the outside. 2 of my colleagues entered, displaying their federal credentials. "Ms. Wellington," one said professionally, "we need you to accompany us to answer some questions regarding potential violations of federal law." The meeting erupted into chaos as residents began shouting questions and accusations. Many had suffered under Catherine's regime for years without realizing others were experiencing the same treatment. Some approached me with immediate concerns about their homes, afraid that liens Catherine had placed might not be valid. Others simply watched in stunned silence as the woman who had terrorized their community for years was escorted from the building. I called for order, explaining that a full investigation would take time, but assuring everyone that legitimate HOA functions would continue under interim leadership. "My primary concern," I explained, "is addressing the illegal cemetery in a way that respects both the families involved and the laws that were broken." In the following weeks, justice moved swiftly. Catherine and 3 complicit HOA board members faced multiple federal charges. The evidence was so overwhelming that Catherine's attorney quickly negotiated a plea deal that included significant restitution to affected families, repayment of misappropriated HOA funds, and a lifetime ban from serving in any community leadership position. For the families who had buried loved ones on my property, I offered a compassionate solution. Rather than force exhumation and reburial, I legally designated a portion of my property as a cemetery through proper channels, establishing a legitimate trust to maintain the grounds in perpetuity. The initial funding came from the restitution Catherine was ordered to pay, ensuring families would not bear any additional costs for her crimes. The community held a proper consecration ceremony for the grounds, with religious leaders of various faiths offering blessings. Many residents attended, not just those with family members buried there, as a way of healing the community wound Catherine had created. During this ceremony, I shared my vision for the space, a legitimate, respectful memorial garden that would honor those at rest there while establishing proper legal protections against future exploitation. For residents who had been victimized by Catherine's previous schemes, a comprehensive review process was established. Many discovered the liens on their properties were based on fabricated violations and could be removed. Others received compensation from recovered funds for assessments that had been improperly levied or fines that had no legitimate basis. Perhaps most importantly, the community came together to establish a new, transparent HOA with proper oversight and democratic processes. As someone with expertise in regulatory compliance, I offered guidance on creating bylaws that would prevent future abuses while still allowing for effective community governance. Regular financial audits, term limits for board members, and clear appeals processes for enforcement actions became fundamental features of the new association. One afternoon, about 6 months after Catherine's arrest, I stood in the now legitimate memorial garden, watching as a stonemason installed a simple monument near the entrance. It read, "This memorial garden stands as a reminder that true authority comes with responsibility and compassion." Below that were inscribed the names of 3 elderly residents who had stood up to Catherine over the years and passed away before seeing justice served. Stanley, my elderly neighbor who had tried to warn me about what was happening, joined me as we watched the final lettering being carved. "You know," he said quietly, "for years we all lived in fear of that woman. No one believed we could ever be free of her." "That is how bullies like Catherine operate," I replied. "They count on people being too intimidated or too exhausted to fight back." "I never imagined having a federal agent as a neighbor would turn out to be such a blessing," he chuckled, "though I still feel terrible about what happened to your land." I looked out over the modest cemetery, now properly maintained and legally established. "This is not how I plan to use this portion of my property," I admitted. "But there is something appropriate about it serving the community in this way. My grandparents would have approved of helping these families find peace." 1 year after my return home, I hosted a community gathering on my property. Tables were set up at a respectful distance from the memorial garden, which had been transformed with proper landscaping, pathways, and benches. Children played in the meadows, while adults shared stories of rebuilding their community without the shadow of Catherine's reign hanging over them. The memorial garden itself had become a place of genuine peace. With proper permits, environmental protections, and a sustainable maintenance plan funded by recovered HOA funds, it served its purpose with dignity. Several times a week, I noticed people visiting their loved ones, no longer carrying the burden of knowing their final resting place existed on stolen land. Many former victims of Catherine's regime had found their voices, sharing stories of rebuilding their lives without constant fear of HOA harassment. Some had formed a community advocacy group to help other neighborhoods establish ethical governance practices. I occasionally advised them, drawing on my professional expertise while being careful not to overstep my role. Catherine, now serving her sentence, had been ordered by the court to write personal apology letters to each family and resident she had harmed. The letters were part of her restorative justice agreement, genuine apologies acknowledging specific wrongs done to each victim. Many residents chose not to read them, having moved forward with their lives. Others found closure in these admissions of guilt. As the sun began to set on our community gathering, I found myself walking alone through the memorial garden. The golden hour light reminded me of that first evening when I had discovered the cemetery on my return. But where then I had felt violation and anger, now I felt a sense of resolution. My professional training had prepared me to handle this situation with precision rather than emotion, though I admitted to myself that the personal violation still sometimes kept me awake at night. I stopped at the grave of Mr. Harmon, the elderly man who had questioned Catherine at that HOA meeting about the property owner. He had passed away just weeks after Catherine's arrest, but not before seeing the beginning of justice being served. I placed flowers at his marker, a simple gesture of respect for someone who had found the courage to question authority even when it seemed futile. My land had been violated, my homecoming shattered, my sense of security challenged. Yet standing there in the fading light, watching families healing and a community rebuilding, I recognized that while I never intended to share my property this way, it now served a meaningful purpose while remaining legally protected from future exploitation. Sometimes justice takes unexpected forms, but when it finally arrives, it brings with it the possibility of genuine healing.